So this is a brief this will be a brief discussion overview of just war theory and one aspect of just war theory, which is use ad bellum. Uh, it's a Latin words for justice pertaining to war, and it involves the decision, the justifiability of deciding to use military or other forms of lethal force in response to mainly to the injustice of aggression, but possibly also to use violent force, military force, for other ends besides resisting injustice. And as we'll see, the use of military force for other purposes besides self-defense and the protection of others, we'll see is unjustifiable from a moral point of view. But here we consider the some basic questions about the use of military force. And this pertains to the question of what morally should guide our response to violations of the norms and rules of international society. In particular, is the use of military force morally justifiable? Is there a rational basis for its justification? That is, are there good reasons that may justify the use of military force in responding to aggression and other forms of injustice? And this consideration has historically been referred to as the question of jus ad bellum. This is thinking about the moral justifiability of military force is an old consideration. It's at least it's around 2,000 years old in the Western tradition. So it dates to ancient times, and similar moral calculus can be found universally around the world in other cultures, in the Middle East, in Asia, in Africa, among many different peoples and many different traditions. There seems to be a convergence or a congruence concerning the moral justifiability of using force in response to aggression. This issue is based upon some basic moral presumptions or suppositions, prima facie moral presumptions. Prima facie meaning all things equal, all things being equal, these apply. That that there's a presumption against doing harm to others. All things being equal, we should refrain from harming others, and that's a basic moral conviction. Within the modern international system, the system of our world that we live in, there's, since at least the 17th century, there's been a presumption of a right to national sovereignty, and that right to national sovereignty holds in our own time. That each nation state has a fundamental claim to its own sovereignty, that is, to govern its own territory and its people in the way that it chooses. And the right to national sovereignty invokes a duty of non-intervention. That is, there's an obligation for other nation states not to intervene, not to interfere in the affairs of other nation states, a duty not to intervene. not to invade, not to undermine, not to interfere with the national sovereignty of each other. So the international system of nation states is grounded in these two moral presuppositions: a right to national sovereignty and a duty of non-intervention. Given those presumptions, we can conclude that therefore any exception to these presumptions must be justified, must be morally justified. If you're going to intervene in the affairs of other states militarily or in other ways, you have to have good reasons that justify that action. If you're proposing to use military force, you're choosing to use military force, you're going to do harm to others by its employment, you need to be able to justify, to provide moral reasons as well as legal reasons that justify the harm to others. And this entails a burden of those who are proposing the exception. So if one government is saying we have a right to intervene in the affairs of another state, the burden lies on them to provide the justification. In that sense, there are six criteria, you said Bellum criteria, that have been developed in the tradition in this moral calculus as standards, moral standards to be used in determining whether the use of force, including the violation of the duty of non-intervention in the affairs of others, is morally justifiable. And these six criteria are just cause, right authority, right intention, the proportionality of ends, a reasonable hope of success, and the principle or standard of last resort. And we can briefly describe each one of these criteria. All of the criteria for the use of force to be justifiable, all of these criteria, these six criteria, according to this tradition, must be met. So if one's reasoning fails to live up to cohere with the standard of any one of them, then one is not justified in using force. So the first criteria is just cause, that the cause must be just. And as the tradition has evolved, there are two basic just causes that are seen as legitimate. The first just cause is self-defense. That is, if a nation is attacked or a group in a society is being attacked by another group, then they can invoke their right to self-defense, and that would give their cause justification. So self-defense, protecting oneself, protecting one's nation from aggression, is thought to be a just cause. The second just cause is the protection of innocent others. And a government has a responsibility to protect its citizens and all those individuals who are living and perhaps even visiting the nation. The government has a fundamental duty to protect them from physical harm. So self-defense and the protection of innocent others are the two primary just causes. Revenge is not a just cause. Using military force to acquire territory for economic gain or political gain is not a just cause, is unjustifiable. For example, the invasion by the Russians of a part of Ukraine, and occupation of this part called Crimea, was a violation, was not just. Its cause was not just because the aggression occurred not on the basis of protection or self-defense, but on the basis of political gain. So just cause suggests that the only cause that's justifiable is self-defense and the protection of others. And this may include a humanitarian intervention, military intervention, mainly to stop genocide in a particular country. The government, and there are examples of governments attacking and killing, mass murdering their own citizens. And when that has occurred, it is argued that other nations have a right and perhaps a duty to intervene militarily to stop the genocide. And this has occurred in various cases in history. The Indian government, for example, in the 1960s, intervened in Bangladesh to stop a genocide of that government. The United States intervened in Bosnia and Serbia to stop ethnic cleansing and genocide during the Civil War in the early 1990s. NATO and the United States engaged in a humanitarian military intervention to stop the genocide in Bosnia. Those are two examples. We'll discuss this further, but after 9/11, the terrorist attacks of 9/11, President Bush articulated a doctrine, which is now referred to as the Bush Doctrine, that prevention or preemption was a justifiable cause for military intervention, that one was justified in intervening militarily in Iraq and Afghanistan to prevent future terrorist attacks. In particular, the use of weapons of mass destruction was the argument. We'll discuss this doctrine later in some detail. The basic idea here is that just cause, one is justified in using military force in self-defense or to protect others, their physical well-being. The second criteria is the criteria of right authority, that the use of force, the authorization of the use of force, lies exclusively with a sovereign political entity. That is, only governments have the authority to use force, is the claim or the criteria. Since the establishment of the United Nations, technically in international law, the Security Council of the United Nations is, by treaty, is the only authority that has legitimate claim to authorize the use of military force. Although that's by treaty, many nations do not adhere to that requirement of the United Nations Charter. But the point here is that not anyone is justifiable in taking up arms using military force besides the right authority, the right political authority. And that authority also requires an official declaration of war, a statement of the aims to be achieved, and the justifications for using force. So if a government is to chooses to use military force, it must declare its intentions as well as its justifications in order to be justifiable. The third criterion is the right intention, and this is connected to the just cause. That the intention to use force must be in coherence with the just cause. One's intentions have to be legitimate, and they're legitimate in terms of self-defense and protection, and do not include the seizure of territory, do not include economic gain or increased power, or any other self-interested intentions. Just revenge, retribution, punishment are also not legitimate intentions. The legitimate intention is to resist injustice, to protect others, as well as oneself. The fourth criterion is proportionality of ends. The goal of proportionality here is also to determine the validity of the cause. And proportionality maintains that the good achieved by the use of force must be greater than or at least proportional to the harm done. That is, if you're only justified in using military force if the outcome, if the likely outcome will produce more good than harm. And this is a check on the blatant use of military force. In other words, the use of military force is only justifiable if it results in greater good and than it would have resulted if you didn't use force. And this suggests also that excessive use of force is never justifiable, that your use of force be proportional to the ends achieved. And the ultimate end is to restore peace and justice. And if one's response is disproportional, if one uses excessive force, then that the harm done there makes it much more difficult, perhaps impossible, to restore peace and justice. So the decision to use military force must be proportional to the ends that are to be achieved. For example, to use nuclear weapons in a conflict is likely to be excessive and to not cohere with proportionality. We'll discuss this further as we go. The fifth criteria is reasonable hope of success. And this is to stop governments from zealousness, to check zealous and aggressive leaders, that the use of force should result in the probability of its use should be successful in resisting injustice and protecting innocent people. It should you shouldn't use force without attempting to calculate the possibility of its success. And this suggests that prudence or wisdom should be used in decision making in order to determine whether one has a likelihood of success. one shouldn't enter into hopeless causes using military force that you know will not be effective nor successful in achieving your ends. The sixth and final criterion is last resort, and this is a very important criterion for justifying the use of force. That last resort mandates that the use of force be the last possible action that one takes. In other words, one is required from this perspective to engage in nonviolent attempts to resolve the conflict. As many nonviolent attempts to resolve the conflict as possible. And if the conflict or threat persists and the nonviolent attempts have failed, then one is in the position of last resort. Last resort can never be known with absolute certainty. It's a rational judgment of the exhaustion of nonviolent means. In other words, one must engage in diplomacy and work to nonviolently resolve the conflict between the nations or the peoples involved before it is justifiable to use military force. Of course, if one's nation has been invaded by a military force, then last resort has been fulfilled because there's no hope of diplomatic resolution once the aggression has started. Also, claims of last resort also are contingent upon one's general historical commitment to peace. That is, it's based on the historic practice of states for determining the truthfulness of a government's claim to use military force as a last resort. So last resort is an important criterion as well. You should use any other nonviolent means as possible, as many as possible, before resorting to military or lethal force. That is, one's impulse to shoot first should be resisted. Shooting is the last resort, should be the last resort from this perspective, and not the first resort. So the criterion of last resort is very important. So in summary, all six of these criteria need to be satisfied in order for the use of military force to be morally justifiable. And therefore, these criteria provide an important moral guardrails, if you will, or moral restrictions on the use of force. If governments would adhere to the rigor of this calculus, the rigor of these criteria in terms of the use of force, the use of force would be far more rare in the resolution of conflict in our world. So the jus ad bellum criteria, the just war criteria for justifying the use of force are important moral restrictions on its use. In our next, there's a second component to just war theory, and it has to do with if the use of force is justified, should its conduct also be guided and restricted by moral principle. So there are two components to the just war tradition. One, which we've just discussed, is the criteria used to decide whether it is justifiable to use force or not. If it is justifiable to use force according to the criteria, then we need to ask, is its conduct also should its conduct also be restricted by moral principle. And as we'll see, there are two main principles for guiding the use of force. One is discrimination, that the use of force provide non-combatant immunity, that is, the use of force wherever possible should never harm innocent non-combatants. That is, innocent people should be held safe in the rules of engagement, military rules of engagement. The innocent people should have immunity. And second, that the use of force be proportional. That is, excessive force should never be used in the context of military action. And we'll discuss those criteria and work with those criteria next week when we discuss use in Bellum. So